A beach estate solves its electricity issues. Tshwane gets a green light for leasing its power stations. And some thoughts on Simon Sinek's book, Leaders Eat Last. My name is Shanley Lachman. Welcome to my channel. So to start off with, there's an interesting story from IT Web. There's a residential estate in East London that has used some groundbreaking technology to solve its energy problems. In South Africa, we're having an energy problem. Load shedding is affecting all of us, and even if you've gone completely off grid, you still have to drive through the city and fight through traffic because of load shedding. But this residential estate, Coral Beach Estate in Eastern Cape, is facing more than just load shedding. They also have an issue with copper theft. The way electricity gets to the estate is quite unique. The estate is about 30 hectares in size. It's next to the beach, so it's not within a heavily populated area. And the way that power gets to the estate puts it in a vulnerable position. There's a power line that transmits power to the estate, and copper thieves are often damaging the line. So the estate has had frequent power outages that often last for days on end. And that's quite unfortunate, You're living in this beautiful beachside estate, but every now and then you have no power for a few days. So there's this energy company called Empower, and they came up with a unique solution to solve Coral Beach Estate's unique problem. They've implemented something called a microgrid, and this has made the estate's power issues a thing of the past. Now, if you receive power from Eskom or a municipality, you're connected to the national grid. This is the network of power lines throughout the country that take power from the power stations spread around the country and get that power to your home or your business. We have power stations throughout the country supplying power to the grid, and Eskom has a national control center that manages all the power supplied to the grid. The National Control Center's main job is to match supply with demand. If there's too much power, they need to redirect the power somewhere else, for example, to a pump storage plant. If there's too much demand and not enough power, they need to start up some additional backup power plants like gas turbines. Or they implement load shedding, something that we're all very familiar with. A microgrid setup is kind of like having a little Eskom that is responsible for the energy supply and control to a very small number of interconnected consumers. In this case, it's about 200 or so houses by the beach. This little grid gets its electricity from a small solar farm adjacent to the estate. Many residents have their own solar power installed. There's battery storage systems as well, and there is, of course, the electricity supply from Eskom, unreliable as it is. Now, much like Eskom's National Control Center, this microgrid needs to constantly match supply with demand. It needs to find the best source of power at any given moment. It must also ensure that power gets to all of the consumers connected to the microgrid. This power management and control is not a simple task. And also, just as with Eskom, the residents did not pay for the system to be installed. The energy company Empower installed and now manages the system. The consumers only pay for the electricity that they consume per unit of electricity or kilowatt hour. And the cost of the electricity is less than Eskom and will continue to be less than Eskom for the next 20 years. And this is a really great accomplishment by Empower. They've also used sun tracking on their solar panels, and this allows them to get a lot more energy from a small space than a static system would. Empower is setting an example here that I'm sure many will want to and will follow in months and years to come. It makes a lot of sense to have microgrids all over the place. When coal is your resource, it makes a lot of sense to have large power stations located there where the coal mines are and then transmit it over power lines throughout the country. But the sun shines everywhere and the wind blows everywhere. If these are the main resources, perhaps backed by diesel or gas, it makes more sense to have this microgrid model to produce the electricity right there where it's needed and used. Okay, next up. So according to Business Day, Tshwane City Council has taken steps to lease Pretoria West and Rooiwal power stations to independent power producers, or IPPs. Now, this, of course, is in an effort to reduce load shedding in the city. The power stations have been producing very little power, just enough to keep them functional. A large investment would be needed to get them to produce at a maximum capacity, which the city doesn't have. Hence the move to lease the power stations. Now, if I was on the IPP side of this deal, I would be incredibly nervous. Renewable energy is dropping in cost and at a very rapid pace at that. Now, flexible generation technology like batteries and hydrogen is also becoming very competitive. We're not very far from being able to supply the entire country's energy needs from solar, wind, batteries, and hydrogen. It's not clear exactly how Tshwane will purchase this electricity for distribution. Whoever is investing in the revamp of these power stations needs to be 110% sure that Tshwane will pay for the electricity, even when significantly cheaper options become available. And let's not forget that Tshwane owes Eskom over 4 billion rand for electricity purchases. And who's to say that they won't rack up a big tab with the new tenants of these power stations? Also, whether we agree with the climate change rhetoric or not, the world is moving away from fossil fuels. In keeping with carbon goals, banks have reduced or eliminated any loans for coal-fired power plants. And at least 2 major banks plan to be net zero on all financed emissions by 2050. A 40-year lease on these power stations does not fit that agenda. In light of the current financial and environmental atmosphere, again I say, I'd be nervous to be on the IPP side of this deal. To reduce load shedding, one thing that Tshwane can and should do is reduce the cost of wheeling. They should also incentivize wheeling during peak demand. If you don't know, wheeling is an arrangement between a power producer and an off-taker with no direct electrical connection. So for example, you could have a solar farm in Donkerhoek supplying power to a factory in Silverton. The solar farm and the factory would not need to be directly connected. They would be very far apart in this case. The solar farm puts that power onto the grid, and the municipality credits that power to the off-taker. The municipality charges a fee per unit of electricity or per unit or per kilowatt hour for this arrangement. It's called a wheeling fee. And this allows private investment into generation infrastructure because it benefits the city. It allows for competitive pricing of electricity for off-takers, and in the case of solar power, it allows off-takers to benefit from green power without having to use their own roof space. Now, Tshwane currently charges about 72 cents per kilowatt hour wheeled. That's their wheeling fee. If you have a solar plant producing power at, let's say, 50 cents per kilowatt hour, this brings the total cost to at least 1.23 rand. Plus, as an IPP, you still would want to add a markup to this to make a profit. Depending on the time of day and the time of year, this cost is far higher than some of Tshwane's electricity tariffs. And no off-taker would want to buy electricity at a higher price than what Tshwane charges. And no IPP would build a plant without any customers. So if Tshwane reduced the wheeling fee, we would see more power plants go up. In addition, if wheeling during peak times was particularly cheaper, these power plants would be built to supply that need. The overall effect would be increased total capacity and less load shedding. So I'm really interested to see what becomes of these power stations. And who knows, perhaps the IPPs have some tricks up their sleeves that will bring a positive change to the city's situation. So let's keep an eye on that. Okay, last item for today. I read a couple of chapters from the book Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek, and I would like to share some of my own thoughts on what I've read. I'll give a couple of points on the chapters that I read, but let me start off with an overview of what I've read so far. The book appears to use some anecdotal evidence for the validity of the ideas expressed. The ideas expressed are really attractive, and it would be great if the world worked the way that the book describes it can work. But because these ideas are so foreign, and even though they're beautiful, it's a struggle to accept. And I fear that I might adopt an idealistic view of what could be and put in a lot of time and a lot of effort and other resources to try and achieve it, only to be disappointed in the end. But I'll continue to read the book. Perhaps as I read, I'll be more convinced. So the book starts by describing the experience of a fighter pilot in a war. And when I say fighter pilot, it's not exactly a fighter pilot per se. This is a guy who's in an aircraft that provides support to soldiers on the ground. The book describes how this pilot shot down troops from an enemy nation during a ground attack by this enemy nation. And in doing so, and the book describes in detail how this happened. The pilot put his own life in danger multiple times over. Now, all the troops he was protecting managed to survive the attack because of his supporting. And so the pilot later revealed that in risking his life, he was merely doing his job. He didn't see putting his life at risk as going above and beyond the call of duty. He further revealed that he believed that each of the soldiers on the ground would have done the same thing for him. And so the idea expressed here is that when people feel protected and safe, and that those in their team have their back, they are willing even to risk their lives for the sake of the team's success. In the second chapter, the book tells of a guy who acquired a company. It was a manufacturing plant of some kind. And he took this company to new heights by creating a culture of trust and by treating all employees equally regardless of their level of seniority or their job description. For example, initially, people who worked in the offices always had access to phones and could make private calls when they needed to. People who worked on the factory floor only had a payphone and they could only make such calls during the mid-morning tea break or during the lunch hour. Now, the new owner changed this and gave the guys on the floor access to a free phone that they could use anytime. Another example, their spares shop had a guy working there and he was behind a locked gate and fence. And if an operator of the plant needed a spare part or some material, he would have to wait in the line, justify his need for the spare part or material, and then sign off on what he was taking. Now, the new owner changed this. He removed the controlled access and allowed operators to freely go into the store at any time, get whatever they need without having to sign off on it. And the chapter speaks about people being more important than money. So instead of money being a tool to make more money, money is to be a tool to grow and empower the people. And this is supposed to lead to greater success. The idea is that when you create an environment where people are valued more than outcomes, the desired outcomes naturally follow. And again, it seems to be a very noble approach. Trust the employees more, value the employees more, invest in the employees more, and make the employees feel safe and protected, and your organization's success will be off the charts. It just sounds too good to be true. I worked at a vehicle assembly plant for some time during my undergraduate days. I worked at as a vacation work student. And the conditions described in the chapter before the changes that this new owner implemented, the conditions described in the chapter were exactly what I saw happening at this assembly plant that I worked at. Operators started and stopped working according to a bell. The store was access controlled. Tea time and lunch time were the only free times for operators. I think that these systems were in place to resolve specific issues, for example, theft, inefficiencies in output, and who knows what else. Removing these systems would probably result in these issues resurfacing. Now, if I had to take over that plant, I don't know that I would make the same changes described in the book. It just seems too risky to me. For me, there needs to be some measures in place to counteract the bad within us, particularly sloth and greed. Now, sure, we can invest in our employees, treat them with respect, but of course, keeping the interests of the company first. And that's my thinking, but perhaps this is why I don't yet own a ultra successful company. And as I mentioned, I'll keep reading and perhaps something will eventually click for me. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you next time.